Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm really excited to welcome back to the show Dr. Jamie Taylor. Jamie, welcome back.
Hi Dan, thanks for having me on again.
Really excited to be talking with you. And one thing to note, the last time I introduced you on the Sports Psych Show, it was merely Jamie Taylor and it wasn't Dr. Jamie Taylor. So many congrats on your upskilling, mate.
No, well, I really appreciate that, and it's nice to know that somebody thinks I'm a doctor because my children still absolutely refuse to call me or acknowledge that I'm Doctor Daddy. So if they're listening to this, then they should be calling me Doctor Daddy.
That sounds somewhat sinister, mate. I'm not too sure. I think I'm with them. I'm not calling you that. Listen, why don't we get started really by getting you introducing yourself or reintroducing yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Yeah, thank you. So I wear a few different hats really. My primary role is as a senior coach developer at Grey Matters and an assistant professor at Dublin City University. And alongside that, I do a little bit of work at Edinburgh University, and I coach performance rugby at Loughborough University as well. So a few different hats.
A pracademic, as we might say.
No, absolutely. And I would see myself as that. I'd hate to think that I was sat in an ivory tower as an academic. But I'm sure there's a few academics that might be a bit upset about me saying that.
Well, we'll try not to upset anybody else, and we'll get cracking with today's topic. As is often the case, trawling through Twitter, as I tend to do, I saw you essentially release to the wider world a paper that you've done with Professor Dave Collins on talent development environments, and that's what we're going to be talking about today: talent development environments, and that paper is entitled Getting in the Way, Investigating Barriers to Optimizing Talent Development Experience. And we'll also probably be referring to another paper you did with Dave, and that is entitled The Highs and the Lows, Exploring the Nature of Optimally Impactful Development Experiences on the Talent Pathway. So we're talking all things talent development environment. The paper related to investigating the barriers to optimizing talent development experience. Do you want to tell us, the genesis of this, where this came from, your curiousness around this, and perhaps give us an overview before we really dig into the details?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, my interest in this is that I've spent vast majority of my career fascinated with talent development and how you help people develop in whatever their field is. So my first job was as a teacher, and then I was a coach in a talent development context, and still am a coach in a talent development context. So for me, this and I think there's a number of really interesting elements of a talent development coaching role and talent development environment, or indeed a talent development system. Now, one of the things I think that is perhaps under recognized is that when we refer to a talent development environment, we're talking about all aspects of the coaching situation. Now, that's a definition that was put out by Russ Martindale, who did some work on characteristics of effective talent development environments in the 2000s. So it's by no means a new idea, but what that idea suggests is that it's not a place, it's not an academy, it's not a talent system. It's what is going on for this athlete, for this person. What are the inputs for that? Now, what my work has done is looked at the flip side of that, is what's the experience of the athlete. So there's lots of really interesting elements of the characteristics of talent development. We know what people will say, and we know what talent development will do to somebody as markers of good practice rather than best practice, and maybe we can get into that later. But the central focus of my work, particularly for these two papers, has been what's going on for the individual in a talent development journey and what is optimal. And lots of people wouldn't like that idea, because obviously what is optimal is a highly individual thing. But that's the starting point.
So what I hear you say there is you're fascinated by the experiences that the players are having within that talent development environment, and you're curious about what specifically is going on and what potentially is optimal, while recognizing that everybody's experience is individual. Would I be reading you right there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's been some other really interesting work that's looked at how important coherence is along an athlete's journey. So some of Vinny Webb, Dave Collins, Andrew Cruikshank uh, produced a really nice paper in 2016 that looked at um, coherence as being how coherent do you want it to be for a specific athlete. Now, coherence being the extent to which different elements of the athlete's experience hold logical connection, how much they mesh together. So, for example, if I am in several different places receiving coaching, which the absolute vast majority of athletes are, how different is my experience at club, academy, international? What's going on for me across all of these different places? Have I got, is one environment or one place promoting one thing, and is another place promoting something completely different? Now, the level of difference there, they came out with the idea of the Goldilocks zone. So a level of difference that's enough but not too much. Now, immediately you're probably thinking, well, that's great, but how much difference? But that's the point, is that it's incredibly contextual, incredibly individual. So it might be entirely appropriate for a young gymnast to have less variability than a rugby player of the same age, because they are closer to the highest levels of performance. And I think this is a debate that working in football academies, one of the things that keeps coming up is how much variability do we want? How similar does it need to be to the first team? What's the academy's approach, both to coaching and to playing? And these things are, I suppose, a constant area of debate across nearly every performance setting.
The greater the amount of variability, the more chaotic it must feel for players, the more confusing perhaps the experience for them. Would that be a fair thing to say?
I think there's a greater likelihood, but I think it's they talked so this Vinny Webb paper from 2016 talked about what are the characteristics of the individual
Mm.
and how do they impact on that. So if you have a very variable experience, very broad, then you need somebody who has got a really robust set of skills to be able to manage and navigate that journey to make the most of different places. Um, Something for example, that some of my work has looked at is the idea of feedback literacy, taking an idea from a number of people in the educational domain. So, how do I make sense of the feedback I get? So, if I get two completely different things in different places, can I understand? Oh, well, that's where that person's coming from, and that's where that person's coming from. But if I can't do that, and if I haven't got the skills to think that through, then things are likely to get a lot harder. But by the same token, is if I get a very narrow experience, I get exposed to exactly the same coaching in exactly the same way at exactly the same time, then I probably move through a talent development pathway. And by the time I get, or indeed, if I'm looking at this from a performance setting, then I can end up in quite a fragile and narrow situation where I haven't experienced enough difference to cope when things do get different or get hard.
That's really interesting, Jamie, because it makes me think the word that pops into my head is standardization. Over the years working in high performance sports, I've often heard this term from perhaps key stakeholders in organizations and clubs, the importance of standardization. However, sometimes I think they're defining standardization as we, across the age groups, across our levels, across all the individuals, they need to be experiencing the same things. We need to keep things quite narrow, quite standardized. But listening to what you're saying, that okay, that might help us to a certain degree, but it can also hinder us. Let's say taking adopting an approach that has, let's say, a single theoretical framework. We're going to work from one theoretical framework, actually can hinder us because we're not exposing our players, our people, to multiple experiences.
Yeah, look, right with you. And I think that the other thing to bear in mind is we might standardize what coaching we offer,
Yep.
but every one of those young people, or indeed adults, are coming from somewhere where they're living very different lives. So you might have, let's say, a football academy context. You might have a child who's coming from a private school, being dropped off in a Range Rover, who has a full family unit. But then you might have the opposite with another player. And then you're going to have all sorts, and that's before you even get down to where do they go to school, what are their pre-existing skills, how much challenge have they faced so far, their maturational status. All of these things add up so that you're probably never going to have the ability to absolutely standardize an experience. But in terms of what's offered from a coaching point of view, well, I agree with you. There's a view that um, it's a really good idea to map out in minute detail, this is what you should be doing, this is what you should be doing, this is what you should be doing, which prevents the coach being able to go, all right, I think this is probably the best approach for these reasons. So we're just going to, we've got an idea of the outcome we want, but I'm just going to make these changes to offer this player the experience, a desirable experience. And that really is that idea of, and in the paper I draw on the idea of horizontal and vertical coherence. Horizontal coherence being across a period of time, across a level. So you might think of that as being a week. You might think of that as being an age group. Vertical coherence being where have they been, and are we building on that over time towards something. And I think that desire for standardization has often come from, right, we can identify precisely it's going to take somebody to get to this stage. Like silly ideas like 10,000 hours. And being clear on that, I'm not saying that deliberate practice is a bad idea. I think it's an excellent idea. But if you structure a training program around, right, you have to hit this prescribed number of training hours to get this outcome, you're probably getting it wrong. Vertical coherence is, right, where have they been? Where do we want to get them to? And how do we mesh that together? Horizontal coherence is, right, what's going on for them across this period? And how do we generate the Goldilocks zone across this experience for them?
In your paper, you introduce the reader to the specific barriers that players might face across talent development environments. We've kind of already unpacked some of the solutions here already, so we're perhaps going slightly about face, but hey, look, life is chaotic and so are podcasts, so that's okay, right? We're kind of practicing what we preach. So perhaps if we take a step back and then we can start to fit some of these solutions a lot, into the barriers. Can we unpack some of the barriers that you uncovered that players are facing as they journey along the talent development pathway?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I suppose it's important to note before this that the paper was done in rugby league.
Yes.
Now, rugby league is a sport that has an absolutely outstanding record of talent development.
Okay.
Now, you only need to look at, let's say, you compare it to my sport, rugby union, the relative number of people that play rugby union compared to rugby league, and the output of outstanding world-class players at the top of that. That there's a lot of very, very good practice going on in rugby league. And I think it's really important to say that at the outset. We deliberately chose an outstanding talent development system because I think if you did it in a poor system where you're working through a system you're having to consider all sorts of really poor practice rather than what are potentially systemic barriers. Now, the group that we worked with were a sample of focus groups from every club in the Super League and a number of a number of um, English national coaches as well. Now, what was identified there was, what are the barriers? Well, number one, pressures of the high performance milieu. So, what is going on at the very highest level of sport that acts as a barrier to players developing their talent when they're on that boundary of good young player, first professional contract? How do we transition really effectively into what comes next? Barriers being, right, well, there are business demands on the sport. There is a pressure for young players to play earlier because of the need for the best players to be paid more and the middle ground players disappearing. So the more young players being promoted perhaps too quickly. There's also a level of short-termism because if a coach isn't winning week on week, their job is under threat. So their methods can often become very focused on the players who are playing now and not on the long-term needs of younger players. So that's I think that's probably an element that most people can look across sport and say, right, okay, I see that as being an inbuilt barrier to really highly effective talent development. Second element was a lack of integrated working practice. Now, I suppose running parallel to this idea of coherence, what we have suggested is that suggested this idea of integration. If coherence is about the athlete's experience, integration is about what goes into the athlete. And that's a really rough way of saying it. But if we think about effectively the different elements of input to the athlete and how systematically they're combined. Now, what that could be is, for example, an interdisciplinary working pattern amongst those support services around them. That could be selection policies. That could be coach feedback. It could be the coach and strength and conditioning coach talking to each other and making sure that they are moderating their load, making sure that they're offering reasonably coherent messaging to that player so they understand what's going on. And again, it's what is done to the athlete and with the athlete, really importantly. So not just what's done to them, but also I'm an athlete, I'm involved in my development process. I understand why that's happening there and that's happening there. Now, in this instance, this idea of integrated working practice was, there were a number of issues with it. One was number of voices around the player. So the sheer number of people that were offering inputs to the player, whether that was family, agents, enormous variety of coaches. And I say enormous variety in rugby league, it wasn't actually that many compared to other sports, but that could be international coach, academy coach, first team coach, all of these different things going on.
Yep.
And I mean, incidentally, we've got another paper that's due out any minute that's looked at how many different voices around the player and how coherent they are. And again, players longitudinally saying, well, I'm getting told this by this person, this by this person. So that could be social media. It could be sitting down with a game, sitting down after a Super League game with Grandad and reviewing it with him. There's all these different things going on. Second bit was about a lack of intra-club role clarity. So within the club setting, who is responsible for this player and who's responsible for helping them get better? Is it the academy coach? Is it the first team coach? Is there a handover? Does that first team coach really understand, right, these are the needs of this young player and I'm going to offer this young player some support here, here and here? Impact of unhelpful inputs. Grandad saying, oh, I thought you had a really, really good game there. Don't listen to those coaches. They don't know what they're talking about. Doesn't matter how many Super Leagues they've won. They don't really know. And then a player's inability to actively and proactively utilize the support around them, utilize those integrated inputs. So if I'm a player, do I know who to go to? Do I understand I can go to this coach, ask for help with this? Or do I go, oh, I'm just going to be a bit of a passenger here? And then final bit was about failures of coaching practice. So coaches unable to meet players' needs. I haven't got a repertoire of coaching skills to be able to do talent development. Lack of a psychobehavioral emphasis. throughout a sporting pathway. So earlier on, it's all rugby, 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 rather
Mm.
than a broader base of skills that will be needed later down the road, and then a lack of challenge as well. So, and we've took the previous time we chatted, we talked about another paper that I did that looked at why do players fall away who've got lots of potential, and the two key factors there were a lack of psychological skills and a poor management of challenge.
The sense I'm getting here, how I'm making sense of this, Jamie, what you're saying, is that there are a lot of voices, there were a lot of challenges, as in there were a lot of barriers here, and that within talent development environments, we need as coaches better conversations, more informed conversations around these barriers, acknowledging them, having conversation around what our solutions might be, and that includes practices around developing. We want a coherent pathway vertically, horizontally, and within that, underpinning that, is an integrated work practice. When we've got better conversations, we've got more conversations around these barriers, we can improve our integrated work practice. So we can deal with, let's say, granddad, and granddad really is getting in the way here, right? Granddad providing ill-fitting feedback, or a scout providing ill-fitting feedback. We have to acknowledge that these exist. We have to have a conversation about these, and then we have to find solutions in the form of an integrated work practice that develops coherence. That's kind of how I'm making sense of what you're saying. Am I somewhere near the mark?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that lots of people hearing this probably going, "Oh, crikey, that sounds pretty untenable to me." Now, I agree. I think that what the implications of this are pretty broad ranging and pretty hard. But I think that we'd be fools to ignore it. I really do think that we'd be completely foolish to say that we can't impact on this. And remember, we're talking about optimal rather than perfect. Now, the suggestion that we would have is that the theoretical concept of shared mental models offers a really useful way to think about this. Shared mental models being shared knowledge bases that help inform decisions. Now, that could be about role clarity. It could be about the needs of a player. It could be about what my role as in the process is. It could be for the athlete. They understand what their role in the process is. But effectively, the deliberate approaches to generating shared mental models are probably a really critical element of talent development practice, particularly in the kinds of contexts that we're talking about here.
So you've mentioned this term, shared mental model. How do we create these shared mental models?
Well, we've suggested, I suppose, in this paper and in a couple of others, this idea of a top-down and bottom-up approach.
Okay.
Now, top-down being a little bit similar to what you talked about earlier, this idea of standardization, but it's not standardization. It's top-down, going right. Ideally, where do we want to get to with a particular athlete by a particular stage? And if we've got those outcomes, the desirable outcomes, it doesn't mean that we're going to be saying to people, "No, you can't come in if you can't do 10 handstands and spin around on your head." It's desire. If we work from the top,
Yeah.
right? What do we really need to be an outstanding athlete in this particular discipline? Okay, so based on the system we've got, this stage, this stage, this stage, and we can start mapping out an idea of where desirably do we want to be. Then, bottom up, where is this athlete? Where is this person now? Okay, what kinds of experiences do we want to offer them along the journey? Now, if you're in the kinds of setting that we're discussing here, that might be a club sitting down and going, right, this is ideally the purpose of our academy, and this is what we would like the academy to be working towards. But when players leave the academy, this is likely to be where they are. Then on an individual and ongoing basis, involving the player in the process of this is, right, where are you now? Making sure the relevant people are in the room to have the conversation and go, right, where are you now? What do you need? What's your role? What's your role? And what's your role? Now, you can also do that across a level. So if we're not in the context we're talking about here, that might be school teacher, it might be club, it might be international coach, it could be club coach. Now, I recognize again, that's really, really difficult. But it could be sitting down on a Zoom call and going, right, well, what are we trying to do? And why are we trying to do it? What's your role in this? Now, the other element of bottom up that we've talked about is the development of an athlete's epistemological chain. Now, that's a long way of saying how they think about and how they consider different knowledge offers. So, if Grandad is offering me feedback, should I be critical of that? Should I be going, oh, okay, I'm going to listen to Grandad because I've got a lot of respect for Grandad, but I'm probably better off listening to the input of my Super League head coach. Now, the other element of that is getting and actively involving athletes right from all the way through a talent pathway, not offering them information and saying, right, there you go, I've told you to do it, now do it. It's, what do you think about that? How do you feel about that? When are you going to go and practice that? There's a lot of talk about self-regulated learning at the moment, particularly across talent development publications, and more broadly. There's also ideas. I'm really pleased to see ideas like mental flexibility, the ability to think in different ways about different things, or as some of my colleagues, so Oni McNamara, Dave Collins, have talked about for goodness knows how many years now. The idea of PCDEs, which are a broad range of different skills that can be used in context and deployed for the right reasons at the right time.
So, unpacking some of that and perhaps getting a little bit more granular, and I appreciate that you might give some subjective opinions here. If we're dealing with a talent development pathway, from what age should we be including players in these conversations, or should we be considering the experiences of these players? If a head of an academy, for example, sat down with his or her coaches, are they having a conversation about an under 11, an under 12, an under 13? Is there an ideal age range in terms of when these conversations start? So that's my first question. My second question goes back to this notion of desirable outcomes. Are the desirable outcomes preferably a set of overarching competencies, or are they individual specific competencies?
So, answering the second question first, I think that what we're looking at is probably you might have the idea of a competency and expertise-based approach. Competency being, right, I can see this, I can do this, right, done. But also having an eye on a more expertise-based approach, a more contextual approach. And that's obviously been talked about a lot in both coach development, psychology, and other supports, in all other support professions. And I look at a subtle distinction there, where it's probably it's both of those things, but having an eye on without necessarily, I can hear a chorus of people listening to this saying, well, you're being prescriptive, and there's no one way to do things. But that's not what I'm saying. It's, let's be realistic. What does this person need to be able to do to perform at the very highest level? Now, that could be making really highly effective decisions under pressure. Then going, right, well, what does that mean? Is that metacognitive? Is it perceptual cognitive? And starting to go, okay, what do we need to develop as a 16-year-old that supports that later level of expertise? To the first question about age, I think that, people groan all the time, but I'm guessing that, Dan, you know what's coming, which is, I think it really does depend, because it depends on the individual, and it depends on, I can't imagine there are too many talent systems that are at the age and stage that we're talking about. So let's say if it's football, gymnastics, perhaps golf and sports like that, then I think from my perspective, it should be right from the very start that I talk to my seven-year old and 5-year-old daughter. How did you find school today? What was going on? What did your teacher say to you? Oh, and what did you make of that? Oh, you got told off because you didn't put your hand up. Do you did you put your hand up, and do you think that's fair? I don't see a reason why you can't start from whenever you're working with somebody, getting to think reasonably critically, but at an appropriate level for them.
I think I agree. I think it's fascinating as somebody who's um, really into personality development, personality over lifespan. That I think they call it the 5 to 7 shift, where children start to become more aware of the world around them. Jamie, when they start to become what we might call motivated agents, they understand that they have goals in their world and others have goals in their world. And what I hear you doing there is not overtly saying this is what I'm doing with you. It's just asking pertinent questions. It's helping the person in front of you, whether they're 5 years old, 7 years old, 15 years old, 25 years old, consider the the interactions that they're having and the experiences they're having within their school environment or their work environment or their play environment or their coaching environment, their sports environment, etc. That's what I'm considering and thinking about as you were saying that.
Yeah, completely. And I'd also say that I think there's other ways of doing it, obviously, as well. So um, I've been trying. My daughter is really keen to make sure she gets her spellings right. Now, she's also very keen on some blocked maths practice to do so. And I've been saying, well, do you want to try some more random practice here? I think it could help you. Um, and she's pushing back at me a bit because it's a little bit more desirably difficult. But we talk through that, and okay, well, why might this be a good idea? And I don't. And for me, that's surely should be a really important part of what the talent development coach does, particularly when you've got lots of different actors who are impacting on their development.
So I'm going to sound like a real psychologist here by saying her compulsion for high conscientiousness around spellings makes her uncomfortable around interleaving practice and a preference for block practice.
And that's exactly what she said just after breakfast this morning.
Your lessons are working there, James. She's a future sports psychologist. Then I just want to unpack epistemological chain a bit more. I just about got that word out. You did define it a little bit, but I think this is a fascinating area because, again, I think a little bit like we've been just describing, I think there will be some people listening in who might be aghast to hear this and to consider youth sport, 13, 14, 15-year-olds involved in anything along the lines of an epistemological chain. They might consider it to be related to early seriousness or something of that nature. Can you unpack that just a little bit more for me? What is this? Why is this important? And what knock-on effects can be seen if coaches are considering this within their practice?
Well, I think that I suppose before I go there, I think you've just said something that's quite important, which is, that sounds a bit serious for an academy player of this age.
Yeah.
Now, when you're saying that, I'm thinking I haven't met many 16-year-old aspiring athletes who are not very serious and very passionate about what they do. It's so if you're not catering for that, I think you're insulting them. I think you're treating them like little kids.
Yeah.
When I just think that's really not fair.
Yeah.
And I think there's a gross underestimation that's out there, and we'll see it on social media. Is that there are serious young people, so let's treat them seriously and help them get to where they want to go. And I think the second point there is this idea of education of the physical and through the physical. of the physical being this idea that I'm going to get better at sport. Through the physical, I learn a set of things that I can apply to other areas of my life as a result of engaging in sport. Now, when we're thinking about this idea that it sounds a bit serious, well, this seems to me to be one of a really nice set of transferable skills that you might take from a talent pathway to other areas. And for those people who are interested, another couple of colleagues, so Graham Williams and Oni McNamara, have also done some really interesting work that's looked at that transfer of skills from the talent development setting. But this idea of the epistemological chain, I don't think you really need to say that word to them. But effectively, what we're talking about is the link between personal beliefs about knowledge and learning to make decisions. So, what do I believe about the nature of knowledge? Do I believe that everything I hear is either true or false? Or do I believe there might be a little bit of a grey area there? And then, if so, how do I make decisions about the information that I'm offered? How do I make decisions, for example, not even about a feedback offer, but if I am dropped, does that mean that I'm the worst player athlete in the world? Does it mean, there might be something that I need to tweak here? And therefore, how do I think and how do I respond to whether it's information I'm offered or a message that's communicated to me in a different way? Now, for me, that seems to be a really sensible thing to do that could have a lot of benefit outside of their particular sport. But the only way you get there is by actively talking to people, helping them reflect, discussing things with them, or indeed telling them things.
So, in summary, you're engaging them in metacognitive processes, thinking about thinking, and you're striving to develop critical thinkers across the pathway.
Yes, and the ideal outcome of that would be self-regulated and self-directed learning. Self-regulated learning being I can make the most of what in a micro way, make the most of a learning episode. Self-directed learning, I am in charge of the journey that I'm traveling, and I can make appropriate decisions about what I do, how I do it, based on the support I receive.
So, still supported by the coach, there's still a voice that could be considered an authority or being authoritative, but having the capacity to assess what's being said to you and making an informed decision based on what you know about yourself as a person and as an athlete.
Yes, and really importantly, the athlete knowing how to use that person. And I suppose the bit that I'd say there is that I think there are clear differences in how a sport might approach that. So I was chatting last week to somebody who coaches in cricket, who works in cricket, and if you look at what's happening in the highest levels of that sport, cricketers are getting so independent and moving from team to team to team to team, whether that's IPL, the Century, Test team, One Day team, um, all of these different competitions, and a hell of a lot of different voices. Now, to me, my suggestion is that needs to be thought about at an earlier stage. Dependency on a coach should be seen as quite a worrying thing for a particular player. Probably more worrying than, let's say, another team sport where there are likely to be fewer voices. But even still, I'm not seeing many team sports where that's the case. It may, however, be different in gymnastics, athletics, where coaches can follow athletes through their careers, and you might end up with two or three relatively influential figures in the career of an athlete. But either way, I'm relatively dubious about the viewing coaching purely through the lens of the relationship between a single coach and a single athlete.
I also think it's interesting. Correct me if I'm going off in the wrong direction here, but as you were speaking, I was thinking of the influence that developing metacognition, critical thinking, that epistemological chain has on the social dynamic. That by being a critical thinker as an athlete, as a person, you can improve your navigation of the relationship between coach and athletes. There's a lot being spoken about at the moment around power threat relationships, coach to athlete, with potentially the coach holding the power with the potential for the athlete to experience threat. And yet, listening to you, if we're incorporating these kinds of processes within our coaching practice across the talent development pathway, and we're helping upskill our athletes, our people, to be able to think critically, that, I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly, but it kind of dampens down potentially that power threat relationship. It doesn't make that threat as potent, perhaps.
Perhaps, and I'm really interested in this because what I read is often very distinct from what I see in my working life.
Okay.
So I'm right with you that in certain sports, power has been used in very interesting ways with athletes. But at the same time, I see an awful lot of athletes that manipulate social conditions to pressurize coaches. I don't work with many high performance coaches that aren't experiencing some sort of uh, the pushback of power from athletes as well. And I think it's often been viewed as a one way thing rather than a bi directional thing. Now, do I view the importance of the development of metacognitive skills for both athlete and coach as really important for practice? Oh, yeah, of course. Does it mean that it's going to dampen or even heighten the dynamics of power in a relationship? I'm not sure. But I think either way, those dynamics will always be at play, whether you are the coach or whether you're the athlete.
Stepping away from the epistemological chain, and going back to your second paper, The Highs and the Lows, exploring the nature of optimally impactful development experiences on the talent pathway. So, as you mentioned earlier, we perhaps can't engage in perfect experiences. Perhaps that doesn't exist because of the complex nature of coaching and the talent development pathway, but we can look to explore what optimal looks like, what experiences we want others to have, what coaching practices and processes we engage in. And a significant portion of this paper is dedicated to helping players to grow through emotion and stress. Do you want to talk to us just for the last sort of 10 minutes now on this podcast episode? Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that, what you refer to in the paper there, and how coaches can utilize emotion and stress to help their athletes grow?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's some relatively thorny issues that that come up in and around this paper. So I think the current state of the research I think would suggest that there is no doubt that if you are going to reach the very highest levels of performance, your journey to get there will probably be very rocky, and at times you are likely to experience emotional incidents that would be described as traumatic. Now, what it looks like, based on a pretty wide body of evidence now across sport, across music, and other domains, is that those traumatic events, the big negatives, often experienced because I, as an athlete, hold incredibly high standards, and it matters, just like our 16-year-olds earlier, being dropped could be traumatic, that those kinds of events, if somebody is properly prepared for them, they can really benefit from them. Not they will, but they can really benefit from them, and they are likely to be necessary to reach the highest levels. Now, what this highs and lows paper suggests is that if you look at the reflective patterns that result from different emotional experiences, they look like they are likely to promote different cognitive patterns. Obviously, lots of individual variability, But if I feel on top of the, if I've won a match, I've won the World Cup, I'm on top of the world, my confidence is through the roof, my motivation is likely again through the roof. But I'm probably not going to dissect things in real detail unless I force myself to. The old idea that if we win, we're going to debrief more and more intensively than if we lose, but we're going to have to really force ourselves to do it. On the flip side, if I have a negative emotional experience, I'm likely to be thinking in depth about what's going on, focusing on real details and really real specifics, and it's also likely to motivate me to do something about it. But both sides of that rely on on the psychological skill set that we've been talking about all the way through this. Now, I think we're at a stage now where we're going, right, so what happens longitudinally along these highs and lows? What's the result of experiencing something great, something not so great? Now, in a slightly different paper, I've tracked athletes over a talent development journey, and what have they learned from highs and lows? And there are definite differences in the way that they think about an event, but also that athletes with a pre-existing skill set seem to benefit from these highs and lows and regular highs and lows, whereas those people who are too positive for too long don't appear to experience performance benefits. But obviously, if you're too low for too long, you've got there's another set of problems. So this is a very it depends question, and a very almost like that Goldilocks idea earlier, that we want variability, but no matter what you do, particularly in this area when it matters, people are probably going to feel upset every now and again. Now, how does a coach use that? We go back to, where do we start on a talent development journey? We need to equip people to be able to cope with and learn from, really importantly, not just cope with, but learn from these kinds of experiences. And we don't want the challenge level to go too high too quickly. We don't want a player who has sailed through, or an athlete that's sailed through a talent development journey and then suddenly they hit senior level and, oh my God, it's hard now. And I think that we see that across sport, is that for lots of people, it's pretty easy to get to nearly elite, but it's always hard to take that next step. And we see lots of people who find it very difficult at that point.
So within our talent development environments, we want to introduce solutions first to players before challenging them simultaneously.
This is where I think it gets interesting. My perspective would be that right from the start, you're engaging in the teaching of skills. Now, that doesn't mean sat in a classroom, putting up your mental skills slides. It means you're going to use a variety of different methods to help athletes learn skills. And interestingly, on a separate piece of work that is currently in review, we've looked at how do coaches do this. But it's a long, long way away from, right, sit down, here's your PowerPoint slides, now you've learned it. Right, we'll get back to technical, tactical stuff now.
There's an integration.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's through the conversations being had between coaches and players. It's integrated into activities and sessions.
Absolutely. And off pitch, off court, off track. It's the active use of role models. It's all sorts of different methods, exactly the same kinds of approaches that we see all over teaching, learning literature. Is there are a whole lot more ways to help somebody learn something than sit down. This is how you do it.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the support is injected into the environment first through upskilling, and then we're looking for moments in the form of, say, activities to be able to challenge players, for them to experience emotion, perhaps in the form of a bit of stress, so that they can utilize those support skills.
Yeah. So, and for example, one of those challenges could be, right, we're off to play in a competition against another top academy side in front of a crowd. And we're probably going to get beaten because they're better.
Yep.
Now, that's a deliberate choice by a coach and by a talent system to go and put these people into a situation where they're probably not going to feel great afterwards.
Yeah.
Or, for example, entering a qualification process where you are going to likely come up against senior international competition that you know you cannot beat, or the coach knows that they are not going to beat. They're going to put everything they can into it, and they're probably going to come up short. Then, using that experience, actively debriefing it, guiding reflection, the idea of teach, test, tweak, repeat,
Mm-hmm.
teaching a set of skills, testing those skills with in potentially upsetting scenarios like the ones we've described, then actively debriefing and going again.
My final question on this, Jamie, would be, if you don't mind me asking, there's seems to be a few people upset at the use of the term trauma. That these kind of challenging activities or scenarios that you're putting players into creates trauma. It's a strong word. Did you have any kind of response to that, where to the people who would say, "Oh, I'm not sure, is trauma the right word?" I think is what they're getting at.
So I think there's two separate things here. My papers look particularly at the highs and
Yep.
the lows. So we're not so there's not a right. These are the absolutes. This is the really extreme negative experience. These are extreme negative experiences, because you're not going to have extreme negative experiences all
Yep.
the time. But does the evidence suggest to us that if you are going to reach the highest level, it's likely to be a necessity for you to experience those lows? I think the evidence suggests yes. Now, does that mean you're going to be chucking people into really difficult situations where they're going to sink rather than swim? Of course not. Does it mean that those kinds of experiences are potentially A, inevitable, and B, if you're not preparing them for them, is that an ethical thing? Is it okay for somebody to breeze through talent development and then hit extreme negatives when they get there? I would suggest not. Is the word trauma appropriate? I think if you look at the voices of athletes who are describing the lows that they've experienced, I think it's wholly appropriate. And I think if we ignore it, because, and this is the interesting thing from an academic perspective, is if you haven't been in and around high performance sport, if you haven't worked with people or even yourself, that it matters so much, that it's so meaningful, just like our 16-year-olds earlier. You can't pat somebody on the back and say, there, never mind, yeah, water under the bridge, when they've lost a match that is probably the most important thing for them at that point in their life. Is that an adaptive thing? Well, that's a value-based proposition then. We clearly want people to have to not be completely blown away from the negatives of sport, but we have to recognize that if you're going to reach the very highest level at whatever you do, it's going to matter to you. And I think that's perhaps the angle that people ignore there. And this is the interesting thing about the word trauma, because obviously across psychology, there's different definitions of that term as it is. But what we're looking at is what's the experience, and not a classifiable incident. And there's some interesting papers out there. I'm happy to send you them, and you can send to listeners as well, that look at different gradations of negative experience. And so as a result of that, yes, I'd suggest it is wholly appropriate, but people often stop at the label, and I've seen research recently that has stopped at the title without really reading through and looking at, say, Jennifer Savage's work, which has looked at, well, what is this? What prepares people for it? What helps them get adaptive benefit from it? It's, oh, I don't like the sound of that. Oof, done.
What really hits home for me, a final point, and I'll get you to have a final word here, is increasing the volume of importance around negative emotion. And that seems like an extraordinary thing to say in developmental sport. From a very basic standpoint, I think historically, sport has always encompassed the notion of positive emotion and positive thinking. But what I hear you say and what your research is uncovering is actually that landscape is more complex. And incorporating negative emotion and what could be construed as negative experiences is something that's vital along the journey that an athlete takes, those who are serious about being the very best that they can be. It's not that positive emotion shouldn't be part of the journey, and as you outline in the paper, that lends itself towards motivation, towards reinforcing helpful behaviors, but negative emotion has to be incorporated into this as well. So I think that's I think something that's really, really fascinating. And a final point here is that it almost feels like the converse of negative emotion isn't so much positive emotion, it's actually adaptable skills. It's having the capacity to flex and be a mental gymnast as an athlete, to build metacognition, thinking about critical thinking. These kind of skills are almost the converse of negative emotion. By that I mean they're the things there that help us deal with negative emotion.
And I suppose I'd add to that is that it's not the positive is just as necessary as the negative.
Yes.
And look, none of us get involved in sport because it's always great. I'm an Aston Villa fan. Um, there are goodness, how many people are wedded to traveling up and down the country supporting their team. Now, there are highs and lows there. Right? There's some really interesting work in the broader psychological field that's looked at what's meaningful, and I think that there is a need to challenge this idea, particularly as lots of governing bodies hold this idea of the necessity of a wholly positive experience of a sport, without really going, okay, well, does that mean that coaches should emotionally abuse young athletes? Of course not. Absolutely, of course not. And we're nowhere near that. But what we're saying is we need to recognize that the highs and the lows are both really good for talent development if prepared for and used really well. But also, another paper I've done recently with Christine Nash showed that in participation sport, it's a really important thing to balance there as well, because if it's too tough for too long, people drop out. If it's too positive for too long, you won't have the skills to continue participating. But yet we want to ignore these dynamics because we don't like the sounds of the words.
Fascinating. Jamie, thank you so much. That's just been such an interesting conversation, and I urge all of the listeners to try to take some time to read your papers. Jamie, if anybody wants to get in touch, if anybody's got any questions, if anybody wants to follow you, you're on social media. How can they do that, mate?
So no problem. It's at JT Grey Matters UK on Twitter. And if they want to get hold of me by email, it's jamie at greymattersuk.com.
Perfect. Jamie, thank you so much for today. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you, mate.
Cheers, Dan. Absolute pleasure.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.